Thank you very much indeed, Vince, and welcome to everybody for Class 2 in our 10-part journey together on spiritual growth and the Enneagram. In our first class, we really set up our theme of personal growth, and I encouraged you to start a journal and to really begin or perhaps deepen your inquiry at this time and into what spiritual growth really is for you. How am I being asked to grow at this time? This is a question we can all be living with. We also took some time to acknowledge the global transformation that is happening on our planet at this time and how humanity is being asked to grow at this time. The trajectory that we are on at present is not working and it will not end well. We need to make a change. When Caroline spoke in the first class, she said something that really struck me when she said that life is transformation. Life is transformation. And I think that really struck me because it was a teaching to me that you don't just add a bit of transformation into your life on the weekends. You don't add transformation to your life. Your life is a process of transformation. It's something that we have to address. We can't avoid it. We mustn't avoid it. It's impossible to avoid it. In this era, our COVID era, I've said over and over again that we will not get through this. We have to grow through it. Now, the lens that we're looking at spiritual growth through is the Enneagram, which is this ancient and modern system of self-awareness. The ancient Enneagram was about marrying the psyche with the cosmos. The modern Enneagram is more to do with finding a way for the ego and the soul to work together so as to achieve this transformation and to experience the cosmos. There are three broad ways of working with the Enneagram. One is with sacred geometry. Another is by looking at the Enneagram as a mandala for 9 soul meditations. And yet another way is to see the Enneagram as a map of consciousness. In today's class, we are going to be looking at Enneagram Type One. We will also be doing a meditation, our 4.1, and we will have Caroline guide us through really a way of growing at point 1. We will also be looking at a path of growth at point 1, which is, I've named the way of perfection, which is actually inspired by St. Teresa of Avila and this book, The Way of Perfection. St. Teresa of Avila said that each of us has a soul, but we forget to value it. We don't remember that we are creatures made in the image of God. We don't understand the great secrets hidden inside of us. So, to Type 1 and the journey that is in offer at Type 1. As we look at this together, I want you to be aware that we all of us have a relationship to Type 1, that we all of us will know people who have a personality with an operating system that is Type 1, and that there are gifts, invitations, lessons that are on offer here at Type 1 that belong to all of us. As we start to tune in to Type 1, I want to share with you a reading from this book, Opening Doors Within. Opening Doors Within, 365 Daily Meditations from Findhorn. And this is a book that was compiled from Eileen Caddy's guidance here at Findhorn. Eileen Caddy was one of the founders of Findhorn, one of the 4 founders of Findhorn, and she would receive guidance, and she shared this guidance through this delightful book, which has been a companion for me ever since I first came across it, in around about 2005. And yeah, it's very beautiful. And I read something just recently which I thought was the perfect way in to Type 1. So this is the guidance that Eileen received on one particular day, and let's listen to this. Why not start each day by getting into tune with the highest good within you? Then carry it forth into everything you do throughout the day. Let peace and love flow freely in and through you, out to all you contact. See my wholeness and perfection in all your fellow human beings and dwell on that. When you can do so, all imperfections in them will be eliminated, and you will be seeing with my eyes and see only the perfect in everything and everyone. Reflect me. Be at one with me. Let your consciousness be of oneness and of wholeness. Know that I am working in and through you, and that your every thought and action is guided and directed by me. Know that as harmony, beauty, and law and order enter into your life, chaos and confusion fly out the window. As long as you remain in that state of consciousness, all will be very, very well. Okay. So, let's take a look at Type 1. Now, each type classically could simply be called by their number. So, Type 1 would simply be 1. But we often use names, and these names are significant because they highlight the life outlook of this person and also the social role that they are most likely to play. So at Type 1, classically Type 1s are called the reformer, the perfectionist, the example, the idealist, and also the advocate. The life outlook at Type 1 is to live a good life. I am here to live a good life. And that actually becomes our meditation for our life. What does it mean to live a good life? Our social role is to be a good person. And when you tune into the energy of one, it's helpful perhaps to think about philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, to think of leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, to think of scientists like David Bohm, for instance. And David Bohm was one of Einstein's students, and a lot of his work was to do with wholeness and the experience of wholeness. In music, we might think about Bach and his cello suites. We may also think about some of the cellists that have played Bach's music over the years, because they will have their own Enneagram Type 2. But somebody like Rostropovich, who has a wonderful attack, would, I think, complements Bach's music beautifully. If we think of a character from fiction, I think we could think of somebody maybe like Mary Poppins, who was practically perfect in every way. Interestingly, P.L. Travers, the author and the creator of Mary Poppins, was a student of Gurdjieff's. We might think of a chef like Thomas Keller, who created Per Se in New York, or the French Laundry over in on the West Coast. These will give you an idea, I hope, of Type 1. Let's take a moment, Vince, just to look at our Type 1 chart. And I've created one of these charts for each of the types. And so let's start here. And hopefully what we will do in this next 45 minutes or so is make sure that we cover the holy perfection. We will cover the basic fear, the passion and the fixation, and also the center of intelligence and the virtue. I'd also like you just to keep an eye on two lines, which you'll see in the main diagram. There's a line from 1 to 7, and also a line from 1 to 4. And these lines offer invitations for growth. And I'll make sure that I refer to these as well. So let's begin by talking about holy perfection. And let's start, Vince, by looking at our picture, a painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. Take this in for a moment. You will, I imagine, be very familiar with this picture. Take in just all of the detail here, and the geometry here, the patterning that's here. We could really explore this for a long time, and we would find all sorts of geometry here which is highly significant. There is nothing happening in this picture that is not important, that does not have some deeper meaning. But for now, let's hone in on those two central characters, please, Vince. Thank you. And here we have a picture of Plato on the left, and also Aristotle on the right. Now Plato is holding his finger up to the heavens. He has a book in his hands which is thought to be Timaeus or Timaeus. And also Aristotle, by contrast, holds his hand down to the ground, and his book is thought to be the Book of Ethics. Now what we have here is a wonderful conversation and a wonderful relationship that at one we are particularly interested in. For Plato recognized that there is an essential universe and also a perceived universe. The essential universe is the universe that we cannot see with our physical senses. And in this essential universe, there is a perfect order. There is a wholeness that makes the whole universe perfectly made. Always think of perfection and wholeness as interchangeable with Plato. That they really have essentially the same meaning. Now, the perceived universe is the universe that we see through our physical senses. And the perceived universe is normally full of chaos and confusion. It's a right old mess. And Plato is asking us to see that actually even this chaos that we see with our physical senses is held by a greater wholeness and a greater perfection. Plato taught about the law of one. And the law of one is essentially the law of wholeness. This is a quote from Plato. Plato said, "The ruler of the universe has ordered all things with a view to the preservation and perfection of the whole." He then went on to say that you are created for the sake of the whole and not the whole for the sake of you. Now, this is rather important to make sure we've got this the right way round. You are created for the sake of the whole and not the whole for the sake of you. David Bohm the physicist and Einstein student, wrote a book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And as a modern scientist, he was able to really investigate and I think verify Plato's works. His theory was that underlying the physical appearances, the explicate order, there is a deeper hidden implicate order. Plato also described the law of one as the law of the good. There is an essential goodness to life. And when we tune into this essential goodness, that is when we experience holy perfection. So let's talk about the original blessing. It took a whole universe to create you. Not just you, but everybody else too. You are a product of the wholeness of the universe, and everything else is too. Every grain of dust has a wonderful soul, said Joan Miro. And that would be true for us too. Matthew Fox gave us the meditation on the original blessing. And I know that Matthew Fox is a very dear friend of Caroline Myss's, and has been a wonderful support to me as well in these last few weeks and months when I've been writing my new book on purpose. Matthew Fox said this. This is a quote from Matthew Fox about the original blessing. He said, "We enter a broken and torn and sinful world, that is for sure. But we do not enter as blotches on existence, as sinful creatures. We burst into the world as original blessings. And anyone who has joyfully brought children into the world knows this. As one person wrote me recently, describing the birth of her first grandchild, a natural childbirth she was privileged to witness. This is what she said. Being present in the delivery room for the birth of my first grandchild and being the first person to hold him stands unrivaled for being the most awesome, numinous moment of my life. Time certainly stood still. Babies certainly are original blessings. But I never know it as poignantly with my own 4 children." So Matthew Fox here is, this is a quote from his book, The Original Blessing. And he's very much reminding us that we are created out of this wholeness, and that each and every one of us is an expression of the original blessing. We are part of the goodness of creation. Now there's a Christian mystic called Julian of Norwich, and she wrote a book called Divine Revelations of Love. This is perhaps one of the first books in the English language ever to have been printed, written by a woman. And Julian of Norwich had a series of 16 showings, 16 revelations, where she was shown fundamentally how the universe works. And at one point she said this: as the body is clothed in cloth, and the muscles in the skin and the bones in the muscles and the heart in the chest, so are we, body and soul, clothed in the goodness of God and enclosed. So this is our goodness. This is the original blessing. This is what makes us a God seed, fashioned most nobly, ineffable goodness, royal personhood that belongs to each and every one of us. How wonderful. Now the drama begins with the basic fear. And each and every one of us carries a basic fear in our nervous system. And the basic fear at point 1 can be described as happening with the fall from grace. Let's put up another well-known image, another painting, this time by Michelangelo. And this is the fall of man, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden, the fig tree, the tree of knowledge, which we have begun to forget about here. This is the fall. Everybody in their bodies, in their heart, in their mind can relate to this idea of the fall. Most of the creation stories of the world have their own version of the fall from grace. And in the fall from grace, we experience the loss of goodness. And in experiencing the loss of goodness, we forget about the original blessing. And when we forget about the original blessing, that's when the basic fear arises. We have fallen to earth. And our instinct tells us when we arrive here, something isn't right. Now, by the way, at Type 1, Type 1s are called body types. Now, everybody has a body, everybody has a heart, and everybody has a mind. But for most of us, we have a way of processing our life where we will lead with one of the types, or one of the centers rather. These are the 3 centers of intelligence. And interestingly, at Type 1, we often show up very rational and also rather intellectual. And yet, if you slow the whole thing down, you'll often notice at Type 1 that actually you process through your gut first. And then you back it up with your reasoning, with your intellect, and with being rational. But it tends to start in the gut. So ones are body types, and instinctively we have a sense something isn't right here. In our heart, we're asking, have I done something wrong? In our head, we're wondering, what is wrong with this picture? Now, there's a fear called Atollophobia. Atollophobia, it's the fear of imperfection. This fear is the fear really of not being good enough. It's the fear that I've done something wrong, that I am maybe in some way a mistake, or that I am somehow bad. And it means that I really have a difficulty in trusting my basic impulses and my basic feelings. And that's one reason why at 1, I will actually leave the gut alone. I'll even leave the heart alone, and I'll live up here. And I'll live in this center because actually it's a bit closer to heaven than it is to everything down here. I have a friend, Rebecca, who, when she was newly pregnant, she dreamed of her own birth. And her first thought in the dream was, I must have done something wrong to be here. Now that's a terrible fear. What do we do with that fear? Well, we adopt a childhood role. We take on a role to compensate for the fear, to manage the fear, and to suppress the fear, perhaps. And the childhood role that we take on is the role of the good child. I will become a good child. And I will become, at 1, we often become like little adults. We take on responsibilities, and maybe more than we should really, but we do it in an effort to be a good child. The childhood role becomes a social role, and we end up wanting to be a good person. So we start off wanting to be a good kid, then a good student, a good friend, a good lover. And all of this is all very well, except that we do see along the way that people have very different ideas about what is good. It might be that our mother and our father have different ideas about what good is. It might be that our different teachers have different ideas about what being good is. And if we're not careful, what happens is we betray our sense of self for the role, and we show up in whatever version of good is going to work. So, what else do we do? Well, in order to compensate for this loss of the original blessing, we take on a mission, and the mission is to perform a good deed. We are going to do something for the greater good. We will take on a crusade. We will fight the good fight in order to make the world a better place. All of this is very well intentioned. But what's happening here, if you can see, is that we have lost sight of our natural goodness, and now as an ego we are trying to manufacture goodness. And when we try to manufacture a good self, it creates an enormous sense of internal pressure inside of us. And some of our good intentions lead us astray. Just think for a moment throughout history of all of the stories of missionaries and the awful things that they have done to indigenous populations. Think of what we have done that now we can see so clearly is absolutely unjust. Think of the racism, think of apartheid, think of segregation, think of everything we've done. Often set up by people who are convinced that they are doing something good and even that they are better than others. Hell is paved with good intentions. Aldous Huxley said, hell isn't merely paved with good intentions, it is walled and roofed with them, yes, and furnished too. So we have to be very, very careful here. For as long as we forget about the original blessing and our essential goodness, this enormous pressure that we put ourselves under to be good is going to end up causing us a lot of trouble, and we will experience a conflict within ourselves, which is very, very difficult to deal with. So, let's look at the passion. Now, the passion is this source of suffering that we hold over the heart. And the passion is often at one described as anger. But for me that's too general, because anger doesn't belong to just one type. Everybody has anger. Everybody has a relationship to anger. So there's a certain flavor of anger here that I want to explore with you at Type 1. And the flavor of anger that I want to explore with you here is resentment. Okay? It's a sense of resentment. And this resentment is, another way of describing it would be a sense of disappointment. I once remember seeing a picture of a cartoon. There was a dog bowing on the floor, looking all remorse, and the owner was saying to the dog, "I'm not angry with you, I'm just very disappointed." In the Enneagram community, we often say, beware of the disappointed gaze of a Type 1. There's a way in which Type 1 personalities can look at us with such disappointment that we genuinely feel mortified. This resentment and this disappointment is fueled ultimately by a sense of frustration. And this frustration leads us to feeling often really aggrieved and fundamentally just disappointed. Now, the disappointment, by the way, works on three broad levels. One of them is a personal disappointment. So let's look at this one for a minute. The personal disappointment is that I'm trying to make myself into a good person. I have set myself high standards. I've created a superego to keep me in training. I have an inner critic that's talking to me all day long. And in spite of all of this, I can't seem to make myself perfect. No matter how hard I try to improve myself, I fall short and I can't live up to my ideals. So that's my personal disappointment. And it can express itself in lots of ways. For example, for me, whilst I've been writing this book, I meet the inner critic Often the inner critic is sitting right next to me as I'm writing my book, and it's pointing out that the sentence I just wrote isn't very good, or that I could have done it better somehow. Interestingly, the inner critic never tells me how I could write the book better. It just tells me that I could. It was a while ago that I had the revelation one day that my inner critic has never been published. And yet I've been relying on my inner critic to make me a better writer for many, many years. My inner critic actually hasn't even written a blog. It doesn't even have its own newsletter. At least I've managed to write a few books. They might not be very good according to my inner critic, but anyway, the inner critic has a right old go at us, and we all know about this. And that's where our personal disappointment can come from. But also we may experience a disappointment with others. We might be looking for Mr. Right or Mr. Perfect, and they haven't shown up yet, and we're definitely disappointed about that. We may also wonder to ourselves, why do so few people have a code of conduct? What is it with other people's ethics and morals? Why is it, now that I come to think about it, that people do such stupid things? And why can't people clean up after themselves? Why doesn't my partner, for instance, know how to stack a dishwasher or organize the refrigerator correctly? What's the point of putting the dairy next to the meat? And worse, leaving the meat out without sealing it in a container. For God's sake, isn't that basic? Doesn't anyone around here know how to stack or order a refrigerator? And what about when it comes to making the bed? Am I the only one in the household that makes a bed, for God's sake? This is our disappointment with others. And we've got to really manage this carefully, especially at type 1, because we're trying to be a good person. And good people don't get angry. In our low moments, shall we say, we're also disappointed with the planet we're living on. Why isn't this world just a little bit more advanced than it could be? This world does seem to be rather elementary. A good planet is hard to find. Why was I assigned this world of all worlds? And also, why can't I make this world somehow a better place? What is it about this world that resists the efforts of great people to make this world a better place? Underlying all of this is actually a heartbreak. And the heartbreak comes from this, if we're really honest, it's that I don't know how to make things better. I'm here to make the world a better place, but I don't know how to make it better. And actually, I'm finding it difficult to make myself into a better person, but I've also noticing with my friends and the people I'm serving that there's a resistance always to being better. At type 1, I'm upset about this, and I have to manage this. One of the solutions here is to recognize that line again, the line that goes from 1 to 4. This line is very, very important. It's known in the Enneagram as the line of truth and beauty. It's also the line which helps us to heal our shame. Richard Rohr is an Enneagram teacher, and he has a personality at type 1. And Richard Rohr, the wonderful Franciscan priest, he wrote a book called Falling Upward. Falling Upward. And he said, we come to God by doing it wrong. He said, the great and merciful surprise is that we come to God not by doing it right, but by doing it wrong. If we can accept that we don't know how to make ourselves into a good person, if we can confess that we have no idea how really to make the world a better place, then a space opens up inside of us where we can experience inspiration and grace that helps us in this effort of ours. So then let's look at the fixation, which is this mental habit, this distortion that we have in the head center. And at one, the perfectionist is looking for perfection. And if you think about it for a moment, if anybody was going to find perfection, then surely it would be a perfectionist. Surely a perfectionist would be able to find perfection. After all, it's what they're looking for, so they must eventually find it, right? Well, it's often the case that the perfectionist has no experience of perfection, and they can't find it at all. And we have to therefore then ask ourselves, well, why is it that a perfectionist finds it so hard to find perfection? And one reason for this is to do with the fixation. And the fixation for type 1 is judging. One of the questions we can ask ourselves in any situation we find ourselves in is, am I seeing or am I judging? Judging is such a familiar habit to all of us that we rarely question our judgments. If anything, we just try to back them up so that we have the experience of being able to say, I'm right about something. But when we really look at our psychology, we will notice that our psychology is full of judgments. We don't just experience a sunset. We say, that's a great sunset. We don't just experience the rain. We see the rain often as bad weather, as a bad thing. When you're thinking, you're judging. And when you're judging, you're not really seeing what's in front of you. You are seeing your judgments of what's in front of you. When you look in the mirror, do you see who you are, or do you just simply see your judgments about yourself? When you look at somebody else, do you see them, or do you see your judgments about them? Now, there's another line that we need to look at 1, and it is the line that grows from 1 to 7. And this line of 1 to 7 is vital for the perfectionist. The perfectionist is also sometimes called the reformer, and the reformer is a really interesting name because what the reformer does often is the reformer tends to love history. They have a huge respect for history, actually. They often want to go back to the beginning of the story. They want to go back to the originators. Ones, for example, if we take something like Christianity, they wouldn't really be interested so much in the Bible because they'll have done their research already and they will understand that the Bible was essentially written up 400 years after Jesus' life. So they will understand that the Bible that we're most familiar with also, by the way, is the authorized edition of the Bible. Lots and lots of Gospels were thrown out and only 4 were remaining, essentially. So they'll want to go back further than that. They'll want to go back to the time of the Nazarenes. They will want to explore the Gnostics and the mystics and the people who had some sort of a direct experience with Jesus. And that will be of interest to them. They'll want to get back to the beginning because they know deep down that actually everything was there in the beginning. It's like a great Shakespeare play or a great Greek play. Everything is there in Act 1. You can always go back to the beginning and find it there. And that's why history is important. It's also important that we go back over history because we have to be clear about the mistakes we've made. That said, the reformer wants to take history and it wants to move history forward in such a way that we reform everything we're looking at, and thereby make it better somehow. So we could look at the history of science, and then we could make science better. We could look at the history of religion and make religion better. This is reformation. This is what we're trying to do here. Now, interestingly, when we really look at judging and this line from 1 to 7, the way to experience perfection ultimately is to be present. It's to cultivate a relationship with right now. Because right now is the closest we're ever going to get to eternity. This experience with right now is something that happens to mystics in particular. Paul, on the road to Damascus, had a right now experience. And in his right now experience, he was blinded for 3 days. And in that 3 days, and the number 3 is vital here for conversion, he lost his sight, which I will take to mean, at least on one level, he lost the capacity to judge. And in losing the capacity to judge, vision was restored. Another mystic, Catherine of Siena, I mentioned her in class 1, said every step of the way to heaven is heaven. Heaven is here right now. Elizabeth Barrett Browning said earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries. Saint Teresa of Avila, in the way of perfection, she was teaching her daughters, her community, that through prayer we can experience the wholeness of God right now. Through prayer we can experience our original goodness, the goodness that we are all of us made from. The greatest joy of a healthy type 1 person is that we have learned to cultivate a relationship with our judging so that we do not take our judging quite so seriously, and that we also we're willing to give up our judging for vision. A perfectionist, a true perfectionist, is somebody who finds perfection everywhere. They see the sacred geometry of the universe working through every single detail in their lives. Now, we might not see this all of the time, but we will see it every now and then. This morning I was sitting in the original garden here at Findhorn, which is really where the story of Findhorn began. And I've borrowed from the garden, and I am going to return it a little later because I think it's probably right to do so. I picked up a pine cone, and when you look at something like this, you cannot help but recognize the geometry that exists inside a pine cone. There is something perfect about this pine cone, and actually when I look at it, as I notice it now, it has actually opened up through the day. So I imagine tonight it will also close as well. Opening and closing. It's not that opening is good or closing is bad. It's that both are appropriate and necessary. Here's something else that I picked up from Findhorn Beach. This is a shell. And once again, when you look at a shell like this, you can't help but notice the perfection in this shell. This isn't just a random event from a big bang. This is purposeful. This has been geometrized by the creator of the universe. Earlier on today, I was at the beehives here at Findhorn, and I was with John Williner and John Williner and Jonathan Caddy, together with their good friend Martin, help look after all the beehives up here. We've got 11 beehives here now, and I got given a lovely piece of honey. I'm not sure if you can see that, but you'll get the idea here. Honeycomb. Like, oh my God, how does honeycomb get made like this? Somehow the bees who have been here for 30 million years are also participating in the geometry of the universe. God geometrizes the universe. We don't see any of this when we are stuck with our basic fear, when we have the passion, we're lost in the passion that hovers over our heart, or when we are judging continually. But there is a way of freeing ourselves from all of this, and it's to do with the virtue at Type 1. And this virtue at Type 1 is what Plato would call a characteristic of the soul. It's an aspect of soul consciousness. And what we are working with here is the virtue of serenity. Serenity. So this really is our saving grace at point 1. With serenity, we will meet our basic fear in such a way that instead of trying to be a good person all the time, we will remember our goodness. See, the whole point is that you can't create a perfect self. You have to accept that you were perfectly made. With serenity, we can ease some of that suffering over the heart, and instead of being disappointed with what we see and what we're experiencing, we can experience things in a whole new way. And with serenity, we can replace judging with vision. What is serenity? Serenity is a mind without judgment. To experience serenity is to have an experience of being yourself without judging anything. Get a feeling for that for a moment. Ask yourself this question. What's it like to be me when I'm not judging myself? What is it like to be me when I'm not afraid that life is judging me? What is it like to be me when I remember that life has never judged me? What is it like to be me to know that the universe, the sun, the stars, the galaxies, they are not judging me? They really have better things to do, and they are not judging me. One of the reasons why we love to be in nature is because trees don't do psychology. They don't suffer from psychology like we do. Trees aren't judging each other. They don't judge us either. What is it like to be me when I am free of judging? This is when a whole world opens up for us. This is Rumi's field. Yeah? Remember what Rumi said? Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Out beyond right doing and wrongdoing, which is where the basic tension rests, there is another opportunity. This has very much to do with the law of 3. All of the virtues in the Enneagram work with the law of 3. And we're really talking about the triangle now. So imagine at the base of the triangle, you've got right doing and wrong doing. You've got good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil, always in opposition to each other. And because they're always in opposition to each other, they're a trap. They trap each other in this essential sort of duality. The only way out of 2 is the top of the triangle, which is the power of 3. And here at the power of 3, the way out is essentially serenity. It's to stop trying to be good. And when you stop trying to be good, you stop creating an opposition to things being bad, And essentially you free yourself from the drama of good and bad. And in freeing yourself from the drama of good and bad, you discover another type of goodness, a goodness with a capital G, that is not in opposition to anything. We could go a step further. Let's go a step further just for a minute, because I'm conscious that I've introduced firstly the original blessing through Matthew Fox's great work here. So here we could also then talk about the original sin. The original sin is a Augustine Christian doctrine. Okay, so it was introduced by Augustine of Hippo. And the doctrine of original sin is not to be found anywhere in the writings of the Old Testament, and it's not in the chapters of Genesis or also anywhere in the New Testament. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the original sin is the first sin. In Western Orthodox Christianity, the original sin is this idea that somehow there is something very wrong about us. We have been created badly. We are somehow corrupt, and that's why we have to make ourselves good. This is a mistake. The sin that we are, all of us, really suffering from is the forgetting of our original blessing. In the Gospel of John, which is my favorite gospel in the authorized version of the Bible, it's my favorite one because it really is the more of a mystical gospel. It's also, by the way, when you really read the Gospel of John, you realize that after the marriage of Cana, which is the first story, Jesus isn't really there anymore. It's not Jesus who's speaking, it's the Christ that's speaking. And that's the best way to understand, I think, the Gospel of John. But there's a story in the Gospel of John where Jesus heals the blind man. So blindness is always a big theme in the Bible, and it's a big theme because we are judging rather than seeing. And at one point in John, Jesus is asked, when he's healing the blind man, he's asked by one of the disciples, he says, "Teacher, whose sin caused him to be blind? Was it his own sin or his parents' sin?" That's all that the disciples are interested in, really, is who's to blame. Jesus answers, his blindness has nothing to do with his sins or his parents' sins. He is blind so that God's power might be seen at work in him. In other words, forget about this idea that of sin, in that it's that somehow we have been made badly. It's not like that, not at all. There's another gospel, which is the Gospel of Mary. And this is one of the unauthorized gospels. This was a gospel that was found towards the end of the 19th century originally, and was eventually made available by the church around about 50 or 60 years later. And the Gospel of Mary is a remarkable gospel. The first few pages are missing, so we dive straight into a conversation, and it's a conversation between Peter and Jesus. And in this conversation, Peter says to Jesus, "You have been explaining every topic to us. Tell us one other thing. What is the sin of the world?" And Jesus replies, get this, "There is no such thing as sin. Rather, you yourselves are what produces sin when you act in accordance with the nature of adultery, which is called sin. For this reason, the good, with a capital G, came among you, pursuing the good, which is us, which belongs to every nature, and it will set it within its root." So what we hear in the Gospel of John, and also in the Gospel of Mary, and everywhere else really, if you really look, what we hear is that sin is of our own making. We are created from the good. And the good saves us from ourselves when we really tune into it. and in tuning into our original goodness, that's how we overcome our mistakes. That's how we overcome our sins. And that's how we grow. So the meditation type 1 can be many, many things. The invitation is to remember our goodness and to remember that in God's eyes, we've never been judged. Not by God, because God sees our perfection. So if there is a prayer to pray, it would have to be something to do with being asked to see our true perfection. No self-image can survive perfection, by the way. So you will have to let go of your self-image in order to do this. Even if it is the image of a good person, you've got to let it go. But if you do this, you will experience grace and you will experience mercy. I'm going to finish my piece now just by sharing something that Nelson Mandela said. And I've been writing about Nelson Mandela this week for my book. And Nelson Mandela said, "Man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden but never extinguished." And in his autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom, he said this. He said, "I never lost hope that this great transformation in the world would occur, not only because of the great heroes that I have already cited, but because of the courage of the ordinary men and women of my country. I always knew that deep down in every human heart there is mercy and generosity. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or of his background or of his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, then they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Even in the grimmest times in prison, when my comrades and I were pushed to our limits, I would see a glimmer of humanity in one of the guards, perhaps for just a second, but it was enough to reassure me and keep me going. Man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden but never extinguished." So let's pause here for a moment and let us tune into this original blessing that created us and that we are an expression of. And let us invite an awareness of this original blessing more fully into our lives, starting from now. It does not matter how terrible our history is or has been. The original blessing, the perfection of the soul, resides in the present moment, here and now. The law of the one, the law of good, is always here. And we can call upon this great power to help us every step of the way. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Caroline.
What a wonderful class.
Hey, Caroline.
It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
What, do you know I'm a 1? So I'm sitting there listening to this and I'm thinking, well, okay, all right, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But the way you describe it's like poetry. You just flow from one to another to another. It was, and when you talked about Matthew and his original blessing, I made note of that. And then you brought up sin in there, and I thought, okay, I might mention something about that. And I'll mention it while you're with me to see what you would say about it. But I always thought that that doctrine of original sin was just bogus nonsense, but it had such authority in Catholicism, such authority, this idea that we're born with this imperfection, imprimatur on our soul, but and it bothered me just constantly. And it really, I think what drove me so much in my own spiritual practice was not only my inner experiences, but also my issues that just stuck. Like, that can't be true. That can't be true. And it bothered me that I was bothered. Like, well, what do I care? Nobody else cares about these. Why should I care? But it bothered me. And one day, when I was in just a reflective mood, it occurred to me that actually it's not about original sin, it's about the origin of sin. That in fact, what the real interesting question is what is the origin of sin? And that came to me when I was now a medical intuitive. And it was at that point that I was beginning to appreciate that we were in fact wired for an awakening inner life, that we were wired for it, that our biology was a theology, that we were wired for organic divinity, wired for it, and that God was in our blood and bones, and that everything, our nature was organic divinity, that our instincts were a system of communication, and that getting to one, that in fact, anytime we act against being whole was a choice, and it was conscious. Now, here's the operative word. And especially now, fast forward, all my life, all my working life, all my conscious life has been about becoming conscious of consciousness, of the power of it, of our threads, of our wiring, of the interior castle, to use Teresa, of the power of us, and why we have this power, and how utterly significant it is. And it boils down to even how powerful every word we say is. And that the whole role of life is to become incredibly conscious of the creative force of every thought we have and every word we say. And that all of it is a living theology. Is that life is this incredible experience of the breath of God in us and around us, and that God's not an off-planet man. So when I saw that, I realized that really what sin is the conscious choice to shatter your holism and someone else's.
Wow, yeah.
It is the conscious choice to use your power to do a negative thing, to tell a lie, to know that I'm going to use my life force in some way to harm another life, or to do harm to myself, or to in some way make a choice that I know other people are going to be held accountable for, or in some way destroy the tapestry of the whole, that as a result of my life, the whole will suffer.
Yeah.
That is called sin when it's conscious.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, Robert, that is why when people struggle with forgiveness, I could say to you, Robert, I'm so sorry I did this. I wasn't thinking of blah, blah, blah. No. The reason you have trouble forgiving, because I could say, I've apologized to Robert. What's wrong with him? The reason is because your gut, your wiring, your holy wiring knows. The real issue is it was conscious. It was conscious. You're not getting to the core of it. It was a sin because you consciously chose to do what you did, and that's what you're not owning. This is called confessing.
Yeah.
You need to say to me, Robert, I owe you a confession, not an apology. A confession. I consciously chose to harm you.
And the line from 1 to 4 is called the line of confession in the Enneagram.
Is it?
Exactly right. It's because it is the line of emotional honesty. It's where you say, look, if I'm not honest about my part in this, then nothing can be ultimately corrected.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the origin. That I think that the transformation, the journey of life is to become part of it is becoming ferociously at one with truth.
Mm-hmm.
There is no serenity unless you're able to become one with the whole and the self. You can't piecemeal truth. You can't tell half a truth. You can't do that. You can't do that.
Amazing, Caroline.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So now I thought what I would do.
Take it away.
Of taking it into the spiritual time is slip into a little Teresa of Avila.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Take it away.
Well, hi, everybody. I thought because Teresa of Avila's, one of her beautiful works was called The Way of Perfection. And of course, as Robert so beautifully put it, perfection was really not her goal. She meant it more that God was perfect, not so much. So it was a way toward divine perfection, not your own perfection, but a way to appreciate that the whole of the divine was perfect. And I have to say that honestly, the older I get, the more I sit in reflection of my own, the more I am, the more I truly believe that life is only this journey of letting go of what does not matter and absorbing what does, and in making choices that release the insignificant and embrace the truth of what makes life better for others as well as yourself. And in noticing the way that the divine works in your life, however you define God, however you see God. And Teresa had a beautiful way of describing the 4 veils of God. And I thought I would share that with you. You know, I made all these notes on it and notes from my own book. And I thought, what am I doing? I could just share, share this with you from my own book. And I was copying my own book. And so I thought I would just share this. And Teresa said that God exists in many forms and in many disguises. And one of the richest teachings about this is that my experience with people is that as a result of religion, there's this separation, that there's some kind of holy, if there is a God, it's somewhere up there, and then there's us down here. And my experience with my own inner life, but with yours, with the whole of how we are designed, and certainly, honestly, as the greatest part of my work as a medical intuitive has been that you became a living theology for me. You became a theological, biological wonderment because the more readings I did, the more I could not get over. I could not get over the intimacy with which one of your thoughts or emotions played out within the theater of your bio-spiritual ecology and within your whole life. That you were breathing with the whole of your life. That one of your mythologies, one of your belief systems had so much creative authority. Creative, here's the operative word, creative authority over the whole of your life. Like a magnet, it drew in and it contained at the end of this belief pattern. It attached to it were relationships, were all levels of components of your life. And that to cut the string of that one belief pattern would release entire chapters of your life, physical things, relationships, and it would change the way stress flowed in your body, the way you dreamed, all attached in this wonderment of creation. And I realized we are these co-creative wonders. You can't draw a line with co-creation at the end of your skin. Where does the power of one of your choices end? It goes on and on and on and on. You are breathing with the whole and creating with the whole. And in a similar way, this whole mechanism is divine order. This is the nature of the divine. And included in this is your wiring. Your wiring. One of the great truths that Teresa emphasized is that God goes in disguise. She described the four veils of God. And why I was so compelled to bring her work into modernity was that I saw in people that what they described as their psychological sufferings, clinical depression, were actually spiritual crises, mystical crises. They were actually mystically lost at sea, but you didn't have the vocabulary for it. You couldn't identify your suffering in the same way that years ago, before modern medicine, people couldn't identify what we now recognize as a bacterial infection. So I modernized, I put her in present time, one of other people, of course, but I did my part. And a mental God is perhaps God's most common disguise, I think. And I just want to share this. Because this is, she says that God has four main veils. And she says a mental God is his most common disguise, because our minds think of God as an abstract theory. We believe that their hearts and unconscious physical bodies and souls are separate from divinity and unaffected by it. With a mental God, the goal is to control God as opposed to being controlled by God. Thus, a separation of interior powers, such as the mental God, from the mystical experience of God must be maintained. Yet, our emotional beings and souls are connected to God regardless of what our minds think. And long before we reach the active intellectual stage of our lives, the divine has already broken ground with the soul. We have a theology in our biology. It is instinctual, just as birds know their paths, and beavers build dams, and whales connect with each other. We are born with the knowledge of the natural laws. through which the divine reveals and animates its presence in our bones and blood and tissue, our cellular beings. And this is organic divinity. In the cycles of nature, an organic intelligence that is inherent in the order of life. And that organic divinity incarnates into each of us as a primal sense of right and wrong, good and bad behavior that is life affirming. So instincts are our first expression of intuitive and individual power, asserting, helping us to survive. And because physical survival is an obvious priority, for many people, their first relationship to God is one of food and faith. Okay, that's Teresa. The second veil, and I want you to just contemplate. This is your kind of jewels for contemplation and reflection, is conscience and personal choice. I'm not going to read all of it. I just want to read this paragraph. This is from my book, Entering the Castle, by the way. Paradoxically, your soul thrives on chaos because it recognizes the hand of the divine at work in upheavals that push you toward transformation. The mystery of organic divinity lies in order, but the mystery of God that speaks through your inner guidance comes out of disorder and vibrates through gut instincts and debates on conscience. Conscience, not consciousness. You begin to expand your conscience into a more transcendent consciousness. The power and consequences of personal choices become more evident to you, and you realize that you're responsible for the consequences of attitudes and beliefs. And you strive to become ever more conscious through a devoted spiritual practice through which you receive guidance. You participate with God. Oh my goodness. I was reading the third veil. Forgive me. This is so old a copy of my book that the pages are sticking together. I was reading the third book, which is Inner Guidance, the third veil, which is Inner Guidance. So let me just go back and say, Inner Guidance says the soul thrives on chaos because it knows you're working toward transformation. And that's the way inner guidance works. It sets up chaos, but the soul recognizes that the mystery of God speaks through chaos. And I want to pause because I did make that little bleep to just emphasize that the soul, unlike the mind, recognizes that chaos is a route to God. Even though our mind always wants order, the soul has a natural propensity to trust chaos. My copy's so old that the pages stick together. So the second veil, forgive me for that little thing, was conscience and personal choice. And this is the one I wanted to read. Unlike your natural instincts, your conscience is an internal system connected to both God and your soul. So unlike instincts, it's like the next level up. And this is something I learned as an intuitive. We're wired to evolve in our intuitive nature. So we start with gut instincts. And then our conscience we're more aware of it. You don't pay attention to your intuitive instincts. They're on automatic pilot. They're just like the fight and flight mechanism. It engages before you're even aware of it. But conscience is the next level up. And so Teresa calls it the second veil. And she said, it weighs your choices and matures with you, even if you don't have any formal religion, anything. It just automatically matures with you. It just takes over. And it it develops your traits of generosity, kindness, ethics, to express characteristics in your soul. Your conscience just develops this. Now, your ego, by contrast, your ego is that part that is more tied to your identity in the world, and to your the narratives that you tell yourself. So your ego can take over things like blaming people, protecting you. Your conscience is that part that will always try to push you to a higher position, to do the right thing, to push you through anger, to push you toward a path of forgiveness, unlike your instincts, which equip you to deal with the external world and its challenges, all of which you perceive as coming toward you. Your conscience engages with the conflicts, strengths, and weaknesses coming from within you. With your conscience, you govern and express your appetite for the power of choice. For the power of choice. Again, Teresa calls this organic divinity. This is how heaven evolves with you, through you. How many people are actually going to have an angelic visitation where an angel comes in the room and says, "Come on, time to go to school"? It doesn't happen that way. It happens this way, organically. So I went through the third veil first, but I said the third veil, as Teresa said, just to remind you in the proper order, is that the soul recognizes chaos as an organic language of God. And actually, maybe it wasn't an accident. Because what occurs to me right now is to remember that as we look at the chaos in the world, is to step back and look at the chaos with the rupturing of order that has been brought about through the pandemic, through all that is happening on every single level. And as I said in my first Phoenix series, and as I will further discuss in the continuing Phoenix series that I will start in October, November, chaos of this proportion is a cosmic enterprise. A cosmic enterprise. This is not done by just human beings. This is a cosmic enterprise, and it needs to be understood from that position. And that's where the soul comes in. And the fourth veil, she calls the mystic's veil, pierced by the light. And a mystic is called to come into an intimate relationship with divinity. Now, you know how we progress? We progress this way. We all start out with a job, and that's instinctual, and that's survival. But a job is survival power. And we want to do something that gives us a little more power, meaning we could choose when we go to work, and that's called a career. But then, as you develop your soul, you want to go for the big leagues. You want a calling. You want to hear God call you by name. You want your soul to show off, to come forward. You want to know your charism. What was I born to do that no one else can do? What? I want my calling. Call me. Call me. You want to be pierced by the light. That's the next step. You will always be unsatisfied unless you feel that, because that is what drives us as human beings. We were made to be pierced by light. I'm going to leave you with this prayer. Grant me the grace of clarity, Lord. Allow me to see the world as my soul sees it. Clear-sightedness comes naturally to the soul. Our holy interior perceives truth without distraction or detachment. Our soul has the ability to see our life path. It turns our attention away from getting our own needs met and toward asking, how can we make others' lives better? Again and again, I'm reminded of how brief this life is, and that it is not about accumulating stuff. Life's about how well we tend to the lives of others. That is all that matters. And no act of serving life is too small, so hover over me, Lord, and this beloved earth, which is home to us all. Amen. Thank you, everybody.